Hello, AP World History students, and welcome to part 3 of chapter 36. I hope that you're reading your textbook. That's going to be really important to reinforce the concepts. And remember, I'm just covering the highlights here for you on these screencasts. If we look at a picture of this map, take notice of the Axis nations and the Axis occupied areas. So, Germany has basically taken over much of Poland, all of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Yugoslavia, Greece, etc., and has moved their troops in Operation Barbarossa up to Leningrad and Stalingrad, and basically had occupied this whole entire region of the Soviet Union or Russia. You can see the orange is allied with Germany. So really all that we have left of the allies in Europe is Great Britain. And then we have, of course, this part of Russia and down here into Iraq, Syria, Egypt, etc. So the U.S. will get involved in the war in 1941. This is what things look like in 1942 to 1943. Now, I'm sure that all of you know that we got involved in the war directly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This is a cartoon here of President Roosevelt looking over towards Europe across the ocean, knowing that things are happening in Europe, that the situation is getting intense, and wanting to help out the U.S. allies in some way. So a couple of ways that the U.S. helped before they got directly in the war was something called the cash and carry policy. Now, the U.S. was officially neutral. There had been several neutrality acts that had been passed in the 1930s. The cash and carry policy was to sort of help get around that by allowing allied nations to come to U.S. ports and pay cash originally for non-war goods and then for war goods, including ammunitions and other supplies. The Lend-Lease program was another program that also helped to get around the Neutrality Act by assisting allies in leasing items vital, what the U.S. said to vital to U.S. defense, and that included leasing things like old warships and things like that to the allies. And then some pretty bold moves were made against Japan. Now, as you may or may not know, that Japan had a number of assets in the United States prior to its attack on on Pearl Harbor. First of all, the U.S. freezes Japanese assets on July 26th of 1941. That means that Japanese people could not access the assets they had invested in the U.S. They also put an embargo on oil shipments to Japan by August 1st, 1941, which means that they were not sending or selling oil to Japan. And as we know, oil is essential for any kind of industrial activity, including war. So, Act 5, this was a pretty big deal. I'm going to include in our day's lesson plans a 2.5-minute video clip about reactions to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I recently watched the movie Midway, which was an amazing recreation of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and I do recommend that movie if you enjoy movies like this. So Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Our aircraft carriers were out of port at that time, which was very fortunate for us, for the U.S., because the U.S. was able to rebuild more quickly and had less of their fleet destroyed than could have happened if they were in port. But they did severely damage the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. So around 3,000 people were killed. Roosevelt called this a day that would live in infamy. My own father remembered this day He remembered he was 13 at the time, and he remembered sitting on the porch in his home in Minneapolis on a warm day and hearing President Roosevelt, a warm day in December, hearing President Roosevelt um, talk about the bombing of Pearl Harbor and then declaring war on Japan on October 8th of 1941. At this time, Roosevelt was ready to go to war. He was looking for a good reason, some would say, to go to war, and certainly this did provide that reason for going to war. Because Japan was allied with Germany, the U.S. declares war on Germany on December 11th of 1941, joins the Allies with Great Britain and the USSR. So this is going to be a really important turning point in the war. Now, Japan will dominate Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, but eventually, as we know, things will turn around for Japan. So this is a map of Japanese territory at this time. I don't know why that moved. You can see that Japan has really control of what we call French Indochina, Thailand, Singapore, Borneo, Manchuria, much of the eastern part of China, and many of the islands. The green is the Allied territory. Of course, here's Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, Midway Islands. These would end up being really important in the U.S. Victory over Japan. Okay, next up. Okay, occupation and resistance. So, one of the things that we need to realize is that there were a lot of alliances, there were puppet states, there was military administration in a lot of places that were occupied, such as France. And there were many people working underground. This is a war of much intrigue. If you read books about this war, I think that you'll find them interesting if you are interested in history, because there were secret codes going around about troop movement and things like that through many people who risked their lives for the sake of resisting the occupation. Sometimes people collaborated with the conquerors. So there were some people that actually collaborated with the conquerors rather than trying to resist. But the resistance would involve things like military resistance, small scale and even large scale attacks against the Axis, who seemed to be in control for the early part of the war. Intelligence gathering involved people who, just ordinary people like me, for example, who might carry messages about troop movements through coding, like taking a book and perhaps like poking out certain letters, and then a person would read through the book and find these letters that were poked out to get an idea of where troop movement or where the next action might be. Maybe I would be a waitress in a restaurant in France that was being occupied by German troops, and maybe I knew German, and I could hear what they were saying, and I would pass on that intelligence to someone else. We know that many people protected refugees. For example, Corrie ten Boom is someone who was in Holland who took Jewish refugees into her home and had them hide there. There's a book called The Hiding Place about her doing that. And then, of course, many people know about Anne Frank and the family that took Anne Frank's family in to protect them from the war, and unfortunately, they were discovered. Other symbolic gestures of resistance against occupation. So that's an important part of the war, not one so much we need to know a lot about in that course, but if you go on to study World War II in more detail, that will be something that you'll probably spend some time on. Women become involved in the war in multiple ways. First of all, they're working in the factories, just like in World War I, because the men have gone off to fight and they were drafted at huge rates. They did did work on the front lines in medicine. There were doctors and nurses that were very active in medical work during the war. They were not combat soldiers, as there are currently women serving as combat soldiers, but that was not the case during World War II. However, the USSR and China, unlike the US and Great Britain, did have women who were active military duty and were involved in actual battles. You can see this in the Battle of Stalingrad. There are examples of some very brave women in that battle. They, of course, were very active in resistance movements, like I spoke about earlier, gathering intelligence one way or another and helping to inform the military of troop movements. Sadly, there was something called comfort women. This happened in Korea and China. These were Asian women that were forced into prostitution by Japanese forces. There were large-scale massacres at the end of the war. As the concentration camps were being liberated, the anniversary of the liberation of the first concentration camps occurred in the spring of 1945. So this year, when I'm filming this, 2020, is the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camps, and many people were actually massacred as the troops were leaving the concentration camps because they didn't want them to talk about or identify them or expose their war crimes. And then some social ostracism for survivors, especially those who were with the Axis, social ostracism against the German people and others who helped the Axis powers. So I am going to stop here, and I am going to put Allied Victory in Europe on another video. Thank you very much.